I was the one who said we could save money if we cut back the hired hands, and I took the night irrigation myself. It sounded practical in town, at the co-op counter with the coffee pots and the bulletin board with lost dogs and used tractors. Back then it felt like a choice. Later out there, walking the rows with a flashlight gone dim, it felt like something else I had signed without reading. Our corn runs from the county road all the way to the creek, swelling with the low hills. In July it stands taller than I am. In August, it turns into walls. The air in there is different from open air. You don't notice it on the first row, because you can still see the sky. But by the third, you're breathing green and listening to your own breath bounce back from stalks. I grew up with it. I told myself that meant I understood it. I knew how the wind moves in it like a long animal. I knew the sound of a raccoon slipping through and the heavy silence when deer hold still. I knew to look for a strip of flattened leaves that means a person passed. That first week of night rounds, it was just me and the flashlight and the hiss from the pump house. I checked for leaks at the couplers, cleared small puddles with my boot, flexed the brittle hoses, listened to the pulse. I'd done it 100 times during the day. At night, every little click seemed to have a throat. On the third night, I found a trail of mud that shouldn't have been there. It sliced across the rows at an angle, narrow and deliberate. The ground had been dry since noon. My boots were clean. I crouched and touched the mud with 2 fingers, lifted them to my nose because my dad did that with soil, like a habit you learn with your hands. It smelled like water from the creek, cold and sour in a way that didn't fit the field. The creek was fenced off. No reason for anything from there to be here. I stood up and the stalks to my left hissed. It was nothing, I told myself, just the pump cycling. Still, I turned the light and held it steady. Leaves, silk, the light dust of pollen. No raccoon eyes, no deer. The hiss eased back like breath going under the covers. I went on with my checks and ignored the mud as if I had dropped it, as if it came from me and so was not worth thinking about. The next morning we sold a truckload to a man who had ordered in advance. He backed into the yard, lined up with the bin auger, beat dust from his gloves, and asked about the weather like men do when they want to know the truth, but don't want to say so. He looked past me toward the field, like you glance toward a person you suspect has been whispering. "Wind laid down last night?" he asked. "Not much wind at all," I said. "Huh," he said. "Funny, the way it looked from Highway 8, like a set of fingers brushing it." I said nothing to that. He laughed once, like he was clearing a seed from his throat, and talked about fuel prices. That night I brought a second flashlight, the heavy one from the shop with the thick lens that doubles as a hammer when you need it. I told myself it was normal. Batteries fail. It's smart to have an extra. But when I stepped from the gravel onto the soft border of the field, I felt like I was walking into a story I had heard as a kid but forgotten the ending. The mud was back. Not a smear now, but a line, thin as a rope, cutting through the first rows and then vanishing between leaves, as if it lifted. I shone both lights into the corn and saw movement, but it was only the sprinkler arm, swiping its arc down the line. The water rattled on leaves and webbing. It sounded like applause in another room. I followed the mud line 3 rows deep and stopped, because I know better than to get lost in there at night. People say you just need to keep one hand on a stalk and you'll find your way back. That only works if you start with your head clear. When the dark pushes up on your ribs, you take a step, and then another, and then you tell yourself you're staying safe, and then you're 30 rows from the edge, wondering why you ever thought hands were good enough. I went back out to the edge, marked where the mud line crossed with a strip of fabric from my pocket, and told myself I'd check it at daybreak. That thought calmed me the way a hand on your shoulder can. A promise to yourself can be as quiet as prayer. Before I returned to the pump, I glanced at the scarecrow. We have only one. It stands in the center patch where crows like to land because the ground is a little higher and the soil breaks better. It's a frame my father welded, a cross with a short crosspiece for shoulders, a bent rod for a spine, bolted to a metal stake. I change its clothes twice a season to keep the birds guessing. This year I put it in my old gray work shirt and a sun-bleached hat. The shirt flapped. The hat tilted. Nothing strange. Except I had not angled the hat like that. I remember how I shoved it down flat because the brim kept catching the sprinkler arm last week. Now it sat cocked to the side like a man listening with one ear. I blamed the wind, though there hadn't been any. I told my wife later about the mud and the scarecrow, like I was telling a person who would confirm the obvious. She did. She said it was raccoons by the creek, and the hat was the wind. She said it in the voice you use with a partner whose mind turns a simple thing inside out. I let it go because I wanted it to be that way. That night before bed, I stood at the back porch and looked toward the field. The air pulsed with crickets. The field looked like a dark lake. I could feel the cool from it. It had a weight to it, like a room before a conversation. A few days later, we got a call from Donna next door. Her property borders ours with a strip of trees and a fence that is more suggestion than barrier. She said her dog, Moose, had stopped barking at the field. That doesn't sound like news to someone who doesn't know Moose. He barks at everything. Tractors, squirrels, the mail, my truck when it's 2 miles off, the UPS man's thoughts. She said she let him out at dusk like always, and he ran to the fence and went quiet. He didn't whine. He stood and stared into the corn. When she called him, he didn't look back. She had to take him by the collar and haul him inside. He wasn't stiff with fear. He wasn't shaking. He was listening. Listening to what? I said maybe coyotes. She said if it were coyotes, he would have lost his mind. He knows their scent. He has a name for it in his dog brain, and he shouts that name until dawn. She said this wasn't that. She said she didn't like it. That night I worked faster. I jogged between couplers, took notes in a small notebook because writing makes a night reel. The mud line had doubled. 2 thin ropes, both angled the same way, crossing where I had tied the fabric marker, like a pair of shoelaces pulled tight, and then lifted into the air. I swung my light at the scarecrow, and stopped dead a moment later, because it wasn't there. The post stood. The shirt hung. The hat was on the ground, brim down, like a knocked plate. But the head was gone. Our scarecrow heads are old foam, the kind you'd see under a wig in a salon. Cheap stuff. They don't weigh much. I skewered this one on the bent rod and duct taped it when it started to crumble. It had no eyes, but I had drawn a mouth years ago for my son, when he was little and scared of it. I made the mouth smile to prove a point that never took. Now there was only the rusted crossbar and the collapsed shirt, I shone my light in a circle, wide into the rows, thinking maybe it fell. Foam doesn't roll far. I found the head 20 feet off, not rolled but set upright between stalks, facing the way the mud lines angled, as if to watch. The smile was there. Bits of tape clung to the base like the last hairs of a plucked animal. I told nobody. Silence takes different shapes. This was the shape that feels like you're refusing a dare. The county fair came. We went. We ate fried bread and looked at tractors with more buttons than they need. The talk among farmers runs to weather reports you can't see, and rumors of disease and someone's kid who got a job at a distribution center in the city. I watched the faces of men my father's age and tried to see whether any of them had been looking into their fields at night and not sleeping right. Either they hadn't, or they held themselves steady the way men do, as if they had decided long ago that the ground is harder if you step fast. On the way home, the headlights caught dust moving low along the ditch beside our field. Dust doesn't move unless something puts it up. I slowed, rolled down the window, and listened. No footsteps, no small scrabble. I flashed the brights once across the rows. The corn showed me nothing. Once we pulled into the yard, the same dust rose behind the house, a second low ribbon running parallel to the first. My wife left the groceries in the back seat and said my name the way you say a word when you're trying to hear if it means what it used to. "Maybe don't go out there tonight," she said, "just to see if anything happens." "Like what?" I asked, and then felt foolish because you don't ask that out loud near a field. I went to the porch anyway and sat. I left the porch light off. The stars were clear, but the field ate the starlight. It loafed in the dark like bread in a pan, pushing up against its boundaries. I heard nothing at first. Then I heard a whispering scrape, regular as a pendulum. It was the sprinkler arm. It has a little defect where the brass joint meets a cheap steel bracket. When it swings full, the bracket drags and then clicks back. Drag, click. I waited between the drag and the click for a second sound, something stitched in there like a hidden note. I didn't hear it. I went inside telling myself the only thing waiting in the dark is whatever you carried out with you. The next day I found a circle. It wasn't a perfect one. It had the slight wobble of something measured by a hand and a piece of twine. 20 rows in, my boots sunk to the ankles. The corn stalks inside the circle were cut clean at the base, as if someone had shaved them with a long, sharp blade. Not broken, not chewed, not stomped. Cut. The ground was smooth, not trampled, except for the places where the cut stalks had been piled. There were 4 small piles at the compass points, each tied at the middle with pieces of blue baler twine. I wouldn't have seen it if the morning light hadn't glanced off the plastic and made a flare that pulled my eye up and down. I circled the circle. I didn't go in. Standing at the edge, I tried to count rows and figure where. If I was on the porch, I'd be pointing. The circle wasn't near the crease where our property meets Donna's. It wasn't near the pump house or the scarecrow, or the path we used to get the tractor in. It sat in a place with no reason to be chosen. I took pictures with my phone. In the photos, the circle didn't look like much. It looked like a part of the field hit by disease or heat. The clean cut was hard to capture. The piles showed up as small smudges. If I sent those photos to the co-op board, I'd be the man people didn't sit by at lunch. I put the phone away and decided to tell no one. I spent that day doing small things wrong. I came back from the hardware store with the wrong washers. I broke a jar of pickles reaching past them for something else. I pulled into the wrong lane for gas and had to back up with people watching. The field sat on me even when I was 2 towns over. When I closed my eyes, I saw the clean white inside of a cut stalk. When I opened them, I checked the horizon the way animals do when they're not sure what has changed. At night, I didn't go out. I told myself I was punishing the field by withholding my labor. I stood at the window and watched the dark and tried to make it decide to feel sorry. It didn't. I went back the next morning. The circle was bigger, not by much. A foot, maybe 2. It had also shifted, not in place but in mood, if that makes sense. It had gained a center not by any mark but by a feeling you get when you stand near something that is busy with its own plans. There was a long, slight groove from the south edge to the center, barely a trench, just the top crumble of soil brushed back. At the end of that groove was a small stone, the kind our tiller coughs up every spring and we toss to the side. It had a single scratch on it, straight and deep, like a nail had been dragged across in a steady hand. I picked up the stone and froze. It was warm, not sun warm. I know the difference. We all do who work outside. This was body warm, the way a seat holds your heat for a few minutes after you stand. I set it back down. I reached for my phone and found my pocket empty. I must have left it in the truck. For a second, I imagined a reason the phone should not be in there with me. Not because of the field, because of what the phone does to a mind. It's a bright box that makes the world feel like paper. The field deserved a person without a paper brain. That is the kind of thought you have when the rules of your day are shifting. By noon, I had a plan. Plans are a relief, even bad ones. I would get a long measuring tape, a rope, and 4 stakes. I would set the stakes around the edge of the circle, pound them deep, and tie ropes from the stakes to the center so I could see change. Maybe I would set a game camera. I had an old one, slow and fussy, but it might catch something. I didn't want to look at those pictures later. I wanted them to be blank. I wanted to feel silly. At the shed, I found the measuring tape where it should be. The rope was fine, but the stakes were missing. They were the kind you use for temporary fencing, with metal tips and a twisted fin along the end that grips the dirt. I keep them in a bucket. The bucket was there, the stakes were not. I swore. It was an easy swear, angry at myself for not putting things back right. I checked the other shed where we keep sumps and gas cans and the heater for the brooders, even though we haven't raised birds in years. No stakes. I checked the bed of the truck. None. I opened the tailgate and saw corn leaves tucked under the lip like someone had jammed a handful there and slammed it. I picked them out and saw a smear of the same creek mud. If someone was messing with me, they were doing a lot for petty. They were also patient, and patience with petty is a bad mix. I told myself it was kids, bored and high, the ones who sometimes walk the cut between our lots and threw bottles at the mailbox. I told myself the stakes had been borrowed by me, and I had forgotten. The way your mind puts things in odd drawers when you're tired. I drove back toward the field and saw an old woman in a yellow dress standing on the far side of the road, looking at the corn. We don't have many people who walk that stretch. The highway is 2 miles away, and the old road is for locals. The woman was tall and thin, her dress washed out almost to white by sun and time. She wore a hat that looked like it had been a hat once, and was now an idea. She wasn't from any of the houses near us. I slowed to wave and ask if she needed a hand, but when I pulled beside where she stood, she wasn't there. The ditch was empty. The fence line was empty. The trees in Donna's lot held heat and stillness. I pulled over anyway. I stood where she had stood and looked at the field. It looked back like always. Big, busy, not interested in me. The rows leaned slightly toward the creek, as they do when the wind patterns set in. Nothing to see. Nothing new. I watched until my shoulders hurt from setting themselves against something that wasn't happening. That evening, I carried the game camera into the field and set it on a fence post facing the gap where the tractor goes in. I knew it wasn't the circle, but I didn't like the idea of walking a dark camera into the circle like a blind man led by a dog. I pointed it, checked the little screen to be sure it saw something, and clamped it down. As I fastened the strap, the air shifted. The corn, every leaf, drew itself up. Not like wind, like attention. I turned slowly. In the middle distance, the scarecrow's head was back on. I could see it bobbing above the leaves, grinning that chalk grin. I hadn't put it back. No one had been out here with me. The hat was cocked, the way it had been the night I first noticed. A bird landed on the brim, considered the hat, and left. I don't carry a gun for field work. We have one in the house for livestock emergencies, and for putting down a suffering animal if the vet can't come. I did not think of that gun then. I thought instead of walking to the scarecrow and lifting the head off and dropping it into the dirt and stepping on it until it broke. I also thought of leaving it be. I did neither. I went back to the house and washed my hands longer than they needed, and ate in silence while my wife told me news from town. When she asked what was wrong, I said something about the newest grain dryer being too expensive. She didn't believe me, but she didn't press it. That night, a storm built. We could feel it hours before it arrived. The dog in the cul-de-sac down the road made a long sound. The lights flickered once, held, and then the rain came. It wasn't a hard rain. It was the kind that turns gravel to paste and drapes itself across fields and moves slow. I should have felt better with the field pinned down like that. I didn't. I slept a few hours and then sat up without deciding to. The house had a new quiet. I went to the window. The rain had paused, leaving a hanging drip off the roof edge and a smell like pennies. The field looked smooth and slick, all one piece. The pump house light was out, which is normal when the system's off. Lightning pushed a dull flash along the horizon, far away over the lake. I could see the scarecrow. Even with the rain, it stood. Its head looked a little darker, as if it had taken water. Its shoulders were hunched the way wet fabric makes you tuck in. I lay back down. I told my body to count something dumb. Fence posts, beads, a list of tools. I got to the third or fourth and froze because I heard footsteps that were not footsteps. Not on the porch, not on the stairs. The sound was the field itself moving in a single path, not swaying all at once like in a wind, but parting in a line from the creek side toward the house. Leaves brushed in a sequence. You could hear the timing of a stride without the thud. It came to the edge, near the place we step in, and stopped. I did not get up. I remained still because that's what there was to do. I listened. The sequence resumed, going back out in a new line, not the same one. I kept my eyes closed because I could see all that with ears, as if the night had an X-ray. In the morning, we found a rabbit on the porch, not shredded like a cat leaves, all there. Its neck opened in a clean line, the skin cut as if by a blade, the spine visible like white coral. The rain had washed most of the blood. My wife said words you say to make a morning normal. She said it had probably tangled with wire. She put a bucket over it and asked me to take care of it after breakfast. I nodded. I took it past the shed and dug a small hole where we throw rocks and rusted things and odd bones we find when plowing. As I covered it, the dirt sank smoother than dirt usually does, like it had been waiting to go exactly there. My son came by that afternoon with his daughter. He works 4 nights a week at the factory and sleeps the day and comes to us like he is visiting a previous life. He asked if the field was doing well this year. He glanced at it because he knows this land is a third parent. I said the numbers looked good. I did not say the other part. His daughter is 2. She likes to run to the edge of the field and tug leaves and bring me a pollen-smeared hand like it is honey. I let her, then wiped her hands and told her and him not to go in past the first 2 rows. I made it sound like I always say that. Maybe I do. Maybe I said it harder. She found something. Children do. She reached into the leaves and pulled back a blue ribbon. It was thin and dirty and had the same hue as the baler twine, but softer, more cloth than plastic. She wanted to tie it around my wrist. I let her. The knot she made would not hold anything, but I left it on until they left, then untied it and set it on the porch rail. When I came back from the kitchen with a glass of water, it had slid to the floor. I bent to pick it up and found the end of it stuck under a splinter that jutted from the rail. I lifted it, and the splinter came up and the ribbon tore clean. Not frayed. Cut. I went to the shed and removed the battery from the game camera and brought the camera inside to plug into the laptop. The pictures were all wrong. Not creepy, not ghost. Wrong in alignment. The camera had turned itself, but of course it hadn't, because that's not how it works. The strap was tight. The bracket was holding. Still, the first picture was the path. The second was half path, half rose. The third was all rose. The fourth was sky. The fifth was the underside of the porch roof 100 feet away, and at a whole different angle. And then the screen went black. I closed the laptop because there are times when adults do exactly what children do when a story goes over their head. We shut it. We go stir soup. We turn the compost. We unspool hose and wind it back up. We give our hands a job that has weight. Around dusk, Donna called again. She asked if we could talk at the fence. I said yes, and met her at the old oak with the lightning scar. She is a woman who wears boots that mean they have seen more than some men. She had a jar in her hand. She set it on the fence post. Inside the jar were 4 dead flies. On each fly there was a tiny loop of blue thread cinched around the thorax, like a belt. It cut the flies in half, or close enough, and they had dried like that. The loops were tied in neat knots. Not glue, not something sticky. Knots. Found them on my porch, she said. Not all at once. 1 yesterday, 3 today. Moose thinks they are food, and I had to box them up. I looked at the loops. They had been tied by hands that know small things. Sewing hands, fishing hands, or a tool meant for small work. You think kids? She asked. I didn't answer. You think the field? She asked after a breath. Fields don't think, I said. She nodded in a way that said she had also practiced that sentence and found it thin. She told me she wasn't going to let moose out after dark until the first frost. She said that out loud like a line drawn. She took the jar back under her arm, and we said our small evening words. I went out to the circle with a lantern because the flashlight felt too sharp. A lantern is slower. It makes a bubble around you that the field respects. The circle had changed again. Not bigger this time. Different. The piles were gone. The blue twine from the piles had been woven into a loose grid across the circle, like a net with large holes, laid flat and held down by little pegs. I crouched and pulled one peg. It was a corn stub, carved to a sharp point, hammered in with a stone. The kind of work you do when you have too much time and you don't care if your hands bleed. The net had a shape. It wasn't a picture. It was a plan. Sections, squares, and order. At the center of the net lay the stone from the day before. It was cooler now. The scratch on it had a second line intersecting the first, and the dust from the cut lay in a neat little cone, like someone had tapped the stone, and the dust fell through one of the net's holes and collected there. I stood up too fast, and the lantern swung and the light slid from leaf to leaf, making a parade of faces that were not faces. I shut my eyes. When I opened them, the light was steady again. The scarecrow stood where it had stood, head slightly askew, shirt sleeves empty. I wanted for the first time to speak. Not words to a person, words toward the field, not brave words. I wanted to say, I know you. I wanted the field to answer, no you don't. I left the lantern there and walked back to the house without it. I wanted to see the dark with nothing between us. The path out felt longer. When I reached the yard, I felt like I had stepped out of a tight shirt. I went to the porch and sat. I listened to my blood settle. The lantern's small light sat out there in the black, like a ship foundered on a reef. At some point in the night, a low fog formed. That happens here, but it was early for it and too even. It sat an inch above the ground like a tablecloth laid gently. I could track it by the way the yard lights from the house and the shed moved across it, dull and steady. The lantern dimmed and went out. The fog held. A voice came from the field. Not a human voice, not an animal's. The closest I can come is the sound of hands rubbing a coarse cloth together, a back and forth, a rasp, and the rasp had rhythm. It said a thing by repeating it. The pattern moved in a circle, then straightened into a line. It did this a long time, and I felt the seconds pile up on my chest. When it stopped, the silence was not empty. It was packed. The next morning, the net was gone. The pegs were gone. The stone was gone. The circle was bare earth, smoothed, no lines from a rake, no scuffs from boots, no crumbs from work. At each of the 4 compass points, exactly where the piles had been, the dirt bulged. I knelt and pressed a finger into one bulge, and it gave like bread dough. I pressed harder, and my finger slid into cool mud that was not our soil. It pulled back with a thin skin of slickness that smelled like the creek. I stood and wanted to go to the creek then, to run down the slope and stamp through the reeds and stand on a rock and find, I don't know, a door. I made myself finish feeding the calves instead. A person has a schedule. I moved hay. I stacked boxes. I checked the mailbox, where I found a flyer for a church we don't go to inviting us to a harvest dinner. The picture on the flyer showed a field stylized in neat rows with a barn and a sun. The sun had lines coming off it like hands, I took the flyer to the kitchen and put it under a magnet. My wife asked what I wanted for dinner. I said whatever was easy. She asked if I was all right. I said I was tired. She touched the back of my neck. Her hand felt like a clear thought. At dusk, with the sky bruised up and the last gnats done, I drove to the creek. The fence there is mostly wire and hope. I stepped over it the way I always do. The creek in late summer is slow and mean. It carries bits of plastic and the smell from upstream farms and sometimes the glint of a fish that wishes for spring. I walked the bank from the culvert out to the bend. I saw raccoon prints, deer prints, a place where a boot heel had pressed deep this morning or last. The boot print was my own. Near the bend, someone had piled stones into a small cairn like a child's toy chimney. I knocked it over with the toe of my boot, not because I thought it mattered, but because it does not belong. As the stones fell, I heard the field make a small noise, the way a person in another room coughs when you say a private name. That night I couldn't pretend to sleep. I sat at the table with a pencil and drew what I could remember of the net, the way the squares lay and how many, the little pegs, the direction of the groove. I am not good at drawing. The pencil made clumsy marks. Still, an order showed itself. The net had 5 long lines running north-south and 4 running east-west. The pegs were at varying intervals. The center was where the stone lay. If I were mapping a small town, the net would be its streets, and the pegs would be houses, and the center would be the square where the courthouse sits, and sometimes a statue of a man who did a thing long ago. I didn't like the thought that my field had a town growing under it. I liked less the thought that the town had no people and was still full. When I looked up, the window over the sink reflected the kitchen light, and then, slowly, gave it back to the dark outside. It felt like someone had leaned in and then stepped away. I stood and turned the light off and looked out. The yard lay quiet. Beyond, the field was a single piece of thick black. I couldn't see the scarecrow. I couldn't see the rose. I could see a lighter strip where the path to the pump broke the darkness. I watched that strip until I made a bargain with myself. If anything crossed it, I would go out. I would go meet it halfway. If nothing crossed it, I would go to bed and lie still. I watched a long time. Nothing crossed. I went to bed and lay still and did not sleep. When the first bird started, I felt relief like I had been forgiven. The day broke plain. I made coffee. I drank it standing. The field stood. The scarecrow stood. The circle lay clean. I got a call from the co-op saying a pallet was ready. I drove in to get it. On Main Street, 2 cruisers were parked outside the bar, although it was morning and nobody was inside. Their lights were off. The officers leaned on their cars and looked up 4th Street for no reason I could see. People pretend for one another that they are not looking for anything. Watching the men do it made me sad. On the way back, just past the tire shop, I saw the woman in the yellow dress again. This time she was on my side of the road, walking toward the field. She didn't raise a hand or turn her head. I slowed and rolled down the window and said, "Ma'am, you all right?" And she kept walking. When I pulled level with her, she wasn't there. No ditch, no fence, no shadow thrown where she should have made one. I kept driving because if I had stopped, I would have climbed into the back seat and stayed there until someone came and got me out. When I turned into our drive, Donna waved me down. She held Moose's collar tight. He pulled and then didn't pull. He stood upright and looked at the field as if it had asked a question. "You hear anything last night?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Heard the sprinkler arm. Heard the quiet." "I hear it too," she said. "This is going to sound stupid, but it sounds like weaving." I nodded. It didn't sound stupid. "I found this on my porch this morning," she said, and held out her open hand. In her palm lay a little figure made from corn silk and 2 short twigs. The silk formed a body twisted tight. The twigs were arms. Around the waist, a loop of blue ribbon, tied in a small, neat knot. "Kids," I said, and this time it wasn't even a lie so much as habit. "Maybe," she said. "Do kids tie knots I can't untie?" I reached and tried. The knot was firm, precise, a sailor's knot or something like it, except cleaner. I could not get a nail under it. I could not loosen it by rolling it. I handed it back. She dropped it into her pocket like a stone and said she didn't like it and that she had to go start supper. When she left, I stood with my hands on the fence and watched the edge of the field. The first 2 rows moved, not sway, not a ripple, a movement that had a distance to it, like an arm crossing a room. It drew a curve just inside the edge, a scallop, small but exact. The shape held a second and then melted back into stillness. I felt my heart change its way of beating, not faster, different. It added a beat at the end of the measure. I walked in then. I didn't go for the net or the circle. I went where the curve had been, pushing leaves soft as a man who doesn't want to wake a child. Knees and elbows brushed me. The green smell was strong. I raised my hands and let my fingers trail the silk. The ground under my boots gave a little, like bread again, like the bulges at the circle. I kept my hands out like a person making peace with a dog. After 6 rows, I stopped. I wasn't lost. I just knew that if I took another step, my body would do something without asking me first. I turned to go back and saw, 3 feet away, eye level, a thread of blue ribbon tied between 2 stalks. It ran across the row like a trip line. I leaned in and saw the knot. The thread was caught tight. The knot held 2 loops crossed and tucked in a way that made sense to my hands, even if I had never tied it. I had the thought that the knot looked like a mouth. Not a smile, not a frown. A mouth set to speak. I reached to touch it. As my finger hovered, the ribbon shivered. Not from wind. From a pull felt through the plant, through the ground. The knot tightened. The ribbon snapped clean, and the inch that remained went slack and fell. And the broken inch stayed, held by the knot itself. My throat clicked. I backed out and the corn let me go like water lets a boat go. On the porch, the blue ribbon my granddaughter had tied around my wrist lay where I had left it on the rail. It was 2 inches shorter. The cut end was sharp and straight. That evening I told my wife I would make the night round early. She looked at me a long moment and then said, "Be careful," in a voice that wasn't the one you use for a person going to check water. I took the heavy flashlight and the spare. I took a marker flag, the plastic kind, to write on and stab in where the mud line crossed. I took a pair of shears with me, like if I could cut something, then something would feel even. The field was already cooling. The ground gave its last heat. The air had more bugs in it than it had an hour before. I stepped in and stopped because I could hear it right away. The weaving sound, the rasp and pull, not far, not near, in the middle space where your chest tries to decide if it should tighten. I stood very still. The sound moved around me the way stove heat moves around a hand. I took a step and it stopped. I took another and it started again. But I had lost the sense of where it was. I went toward where I thought it might be, and the field decided I had been invited enough. I won't say it closed in. That's the kind of thing people say when they want their fear to sound like a thing. It didn't close. It stayed exactly where it was, leaf by leaf, stalk by stalk, and it made me aware of how many of them there were, and how many hands you would need to count them, and how small you are when a number gets away from you. I turned my head to make myself smaller, and my light fell on the scarecrow. It stood not 3 rows away, where it had never been because the post is anchored in the center patch, and you can't just move it. Yet there it was, 3 rows away, facing me. The head tilted. The grin looked like it always looked. The shirt hung and dripped a little. The sleeves were empty. The post that should have held it wasn't there. The crossbar wasn't. I lifted the light higher. The scarecrow didn't throw a shadow where it should have thrown one. The ground at its feet, the way leaves lay, the way soil held shape, looked both untouched and deeply pressed, as if many feet had stepped precisely the same square. "All right," I said, to my own chest, more than to the thing. My voice wasn't steady. "All right." Behind me, something made a small, regular noise, like thread pulling through rough cloth. The first pull was slow. The second was faster. The third was steady, and then there were too many of them to count, coming from different rows, syncing up without trying. The scarecrow turned its head, not with a jerk, not with a snap, but with a human plainness, like a person answering to their name from across a table, and looked past me, over my shoulder, toward the path to the house. I spun around, both lights up, and saw the blue ribbon strung between the stalks, not one line but many, at the height of a man's thigh, and a child's chest and a dog's neck. Lines I could now see everywhere because I had seen one and taught my eyes how. The knots all faced the same way. A small breeze might have made them flutter and look like little mouths talking. There was no breeze. They were still. In the near distance, where the rows meet the driveway's gravel edge, I heard my wife call my name. I raised my head and answered, but my answer didn't go straight. It slid along the leaves and pushed out somewhere else, as if the rows had angled my voice. She called again, closer. I took one step and the ribbons tightened, not in front of me, not behind, but along my left side, running up the row like a drawstring pulling a bag. The knots cinched. I could hear each knot take hold. Little dry clicks. A sound like pins going into cloth. I tried to lift the ribbon and it held firm, not elastic like fabric, hard as wire. It left a faint line on my hand where I pushed. In that line, the skin felt numb, as if the pressure had asked the nerves to wait outside a minute. "Here," I shouted, and the rows offered my shout to the place where I was not. My wife stepped onto the path then. I could see her white shirt through the leaves. She had her phone light out and she was sweeping it side to side. Moose barked at the fence from Donna's yard, one sharp bark, and then none, as if he had rusted. "Don't come in," I said, and the rows carried that to somewhere else, to the creek maybe, or the road. My wife took a careful step forward. "Stop," I said, and this time the field gave it back to the path where she stood, the word a little chewed by leaves. She froze. "Stay there," I said. She stayed. I turned to see the scarecrow again, to convince myself it was cloth and straw and wire, to decide what to do about it. It was gone. The space where it had been was as full and empty as the rest. I turned a full circle and saw only corn and ribbon and knots, and the faint blur of my own breath shaking in the light. The weaving sound returned to my right, closer than my shoulder, the kind of closeness you feel when you share a bench with a stranger, and you both look straight ahead. It made 3 pulls, and the 4th, and the 5th, and the 6th. And my mind filled itself with the number because number is comfort. Because counting is a rope you loop around a question and pull tight. That's when the first knot began to speak. It didn't make a word. It made a small click in my fingers, a change from tight to tighter, then a slack as thin as a blink. It did it again. Tight, slack, tight. A beat skipped. Tight. 2 beats. Tight. The knot wasn't alive. The plant wasn't either, not that way. But the knot was saying something in a rhythm that felt like a person clearing a throat and trying again until the sound had shape. I remembered my father tapping a wrench against a pipe to call me from the far side of the shed. 2 taps. A space. 1 tap. A space. The sound meant my name. He didn't yell. He wasn't the kind who liked to give his voice away. He kept it in his pocket like a knife he'd sharpened. I thought of that while the knot clicked in my fingers. It was crude and careful at once. "Don't take a step," I said to my wife, still fixed to her place on the path. The field let that part go where I wanted it to go, maybe because it liked the order in the words. I pressed the knot. It pressed back. Above it, the next knot along the same ribbon clicked. Then the next. A line of clicks ran the length of the row like a zipper pulled half down and left. It stopped at the post where the ribbon had been tied to a stalk that had been cut and sharpened. The ribbon there looped around twice, and the double loops squeezed until the stalk flexed. The field wanted me to move. I could feel it in the way the ribbons shifted, not pulling me forward, pulling the space around me into lanes. If I lifted a foot, it would decide the lane. "Turn off your light," I said. "Stay right there and turn off your light." She did it. The path went dark and my lights were the only ones. The knots clicked once more like a man saying, "Good, now we can start." I leaned in and put the flashlight beam close to the knot. The ribbon fibers were tight as a tendon. The knot had been rolled under and through twice and tucked, the tag end trimmed clean. Not a granny knot. Not the square knot we tie when we throw a tarp over a wagon and want it to hold. It was cleaner than that. The kind of knot you'd use when you expect to come back and untie it, and you want it to look like something when you do. I took the shears out of my back pocket. When the blades touched the ribbon went slack, and then was gone. Not cut, not snapped. Gone. The blades chewed air and met each other with a small empty click that made my teeth hurt. "All right," I said, and said it again because I needed a word to put the breath through. A row over, a knot tightened. The ribbon there wasn't mine. I hadn't seen it until it changed. The field had more lines than I'd taught my eyes to see. I lifted the light, and the whole place came alive with small movements, ribbon to ribbon, knot to knot, a careful stirring like a room of old women lifting thread to their mouths to wet it and pulling it through cloth. My scalp prickled and went cold. A voice spoke from the path. My wife. Soft. What should I do? "Stay," I said. "Say my name. Don't come in. Not for any reason. Just keep saying my name." She did. She said it steady. The field pressed her sound sideways and put it back in my ear as if it had been stored there a minute. I took a step toward the circle because that seemed like the only thing to do, and every line of ribbon that had been waiting in a loop at knee height rose to waist, and the knots held tight, making lanes. I moved through one. I didn't pick it. It picked me. It had a faint smell like wet thread left in a jar in the sun. The scarecrow was ahead of me again. It had no way to move, but it had moved. The head wasn't foam anymore. It was a round made from something wrapped and wrapped and wrapped, wet and dark, the color that happens to rope when you leave it in a bucket. The mouth line was a groove. The shirt hung the way a shirt hangs when there's a body inside it, and the shoulders have shrugged twice to settle the seam. "I see you," I said, which wasn't true in the way a person sees. I saw the shape. Seeing isn't knowing. I got near enough to grab the sleeve. I squeezed. It was not straw. It was not corn leaves. It was tight stuff, woven and damp, warm the way that stone had been warm, and under my hand it gave a little, like a throat. I jerked back and tripped against a line. The ribbon held and did not give. It cut into the fabric over my thigh, and then through it, and touched the skin in a clean slide that didn't bleed right away. I reached down and the ribbon let go a little, and then lifted again like it had been testing the depth and found it. "Don't," my wife said from the path and didn't know what she meant by the don't. I did. Don't pull. Don't fight it that way. That wasn't the tool. I thought of the circle. I thought of the net laid flat and the pegs. You don't fight a net with hands. You take the pegs. You break the frame. The field knew that I knew because it liked men who make plans. It fed us enough seasons to make us think we were the ones deciding. I moved sideways, and the lanes shifted with me, not to stop me, but to guide me into a curve. At the end of the curve stood one of those bulges where the dirt had been soft as bread, a small rise in the row where nothing should rise. I stopped. The rise had a hole in the top like a dimple. Inside the dimple was a blue tag, ribbon. The tag was worked into the mud, and when the light hit it, the shine came up dull and mean. Everything in me wanted to put my finger in there. It wanted that because the field wanted it. I crouched and put the flat of the shears over the hole and pressed. The mud gave and then grabbed the steel and held it. Not much. Just enough to say, "This is mine too." I thought of fire. Not because fire was smart, but because fire is one of the few things a field respects. I thought of the jug in the shed with the fuel we use to help damp wood catch. I thought of a match. I thought of smoke. The picture rose quick and then fell. You don't light a field in August and expect to keep your life. You don't do it if you have neighbors you plan to look in the eye again. "Say my name," I said to my wife. She did. She kept it steady and shipped it to me through the leaves. "I need a length of twine," I said. "The blue stuff in the shed. Bring it to the edge and set it down and go back." She didn't ask why. She went. I could hear the porch. I could hear a cupboard. I could hear the back door. I could hear my name between all that, sometimes mangled by the rows, and sometimes clear as if saying made a path. While she was gone, the knots clicked and the lines rose and fell. The scarecrow faced me, and then turned its head past me again, toward the path, and I had a thought that didn't feel like my thought at all. It was simple and hard. If this thing wants a path to the house, it will make one. If it wants a path to the shed, it will make one. The lines I saw were only the ones it needed me to see. My wife came back and set the twine on the ground and stepped away. The field let that go. I slid my foot out between the lines and hooked the twine with the heel and dragged it until I could reach it. The knots watched like a room of old eyes watching a child pick up scissors. I tied the twine around the shears handle and looped it around my wrist. The knot I made was ugly and fast, the kind you make when you're trying not to think. I fed the end of the twine into the hole in the bulge and pulled it back. It scraped and came out wet and hissed like hair under a razor. The twine had taken on that creek smell. "All right," I said, because I don't have other words, and I stood and stepped over the line in front of me, and the lines moved, and my step landed where the field wanted it, and I was on the way to the circle whether or not I thought I'd chosen it. On the ground at the circle's edge lay my lantern, dead from last night. In the middle of the circle, not buried, not raised, the ground was open and clean as a tabletop. It was dry when it should have been damp from the night and the fog. The center had a new mark, not a groove. A long, straight, shallow cut that started at the south edge and bisected the circle and ended at the north edge. It had 2 small branches near the center, just a hair off the main line. The shape you'd get if you were laying a map and wanted to mark a road none of the others had noticed. I didn't step into the circle. I cut the lines that ran near it, not with the shears because the shears cut nothing the field meant to hold, but with my hands, picking the bow of each loop with my thumbnail until my skin felt like sand. The loops opened when I opened them. They did not resist me that way. The field liked a man who did not mind small work. As I picked, the knots kept speaking. I paid attention to their rhythm. Tight, slack, tight. Pause. Tight, tight. It wasn't random. It had an order you could write. I had written orders and numbers in a little book all my life. The rhythm began to settle into a code my head could carry. Not letters, not the way a radio man listens, but counts. A row of 3s, a gap, a row of 5s and then 4s. I didn't translate. I don't think it wanted me to. I think it wanted me to feel a body of a message. Not what it says, that it has said. I finished the loop nearest the circle and stood. My knees popped. I felt old all at once and then not old at all, just a size next to a very large thing. The scarecrow was behind me. I didn't hear it go. I turned and faced it because you face it. You don't pretend you don't see. Up close, the head was not a head. It was a ball of soaked ribbon wrapped around a frame of corn stubs, and what I had thought was a mouth was a place where the ribbon had cut deeper, and the dark underneath showed through as a line. A drop hung there and did not fall. "You want what?" I said. "Say it like a person would. Use a word." A knot near my knee clicked and then another, and the ribbon there lifted and kissed the cut in my thigh. It stung. That was an answer. "You can have me," I said, and as soon as I said it, I knew I had meant it for hours. "You can have me if you stay out of the house. You leave her. You leave the girl. You leave the neighbor's dog. I'm not worth much, but I'm worth that." The scarecrow turned its head slow. It looked at the path again, and then back at me, and then down. It didn't nod. It didn't agree. It did something worse. It stood still enough that I felt every movement in the field that was not it. Hundreds of tiny shifts. Thousands. The rose breathing, the knots clicking, the stiff rip of a dry leaf somewhere near the creek. A frog making a single sound and then nothing. It let me hear the size of the thing I was bargaining with. "No," my wife said from the path because she had heard enough. "No, don't do it." She took a step like she was stepping onto ice. The field let her voice through and blocked her foot with a row of lines that were not there a breath before. The knots clicked. The lines untangled themselves and set again, neat as a braid. "I made this," I said, "not the field, not the corn, the situation. I told the co-op we could cut hands. I told myself I could do the night work. It heard me. It likes men who say we'll do what others won't." Saying that out loud made a quiet spot open in me. Not peace, just a place to put my feet. I stepped into the circle. Nothing lunged. No hand came up. The ground held me like it holds a fence post before you tamp it. The air went warmer. The center line, the shallow cut, had an edge to it that caught at my boot sole. In the corner of my eye, a loop of ribbon rose like a snake and then lowered again. I stood and waited. The knots began to move in runs, like a fisher unraveling line from a reel and letting it run over a thumb. I felt it in my hands even without touching. I lifted my arms out a little from my sides, and the lines thickened at elbow height and wrist height and rose clean. Threads pulled taut without touching skin. I could see where they would go. I did not step to meet them. I waited for them to come. Behind me, the scarecrow moved for the first time in a way that was not a trick of place. It didn't step. It settled. The shirt hung different. The head tipped forward just a degree. The ribbon at its mouth line tightened and showed two other lines underneath. And I had the clear thought that if I asked it to open that mouth, it would do it, and something would be inside it that would not look like any mouth I had seen. I opened my hands. "Make it fast," I said, which was a funny thing to ask a loom. It isn't built for fast. It is built for right. The lines came. They did not touch like a person touches. They touched the way a glove touches nail heads and pulled. My wrists went numb. My fingers went cold and then hot. The loops formed by themselves. I didn't resist. I couldn't. Not because I was bound. Because it was stupid to resist the weather. "Say my name," I told my wife. "Keep saying it." She did. The field let each time through a little worse. The first loop took my left wrist. Clean. The second loop took my right. A third loop found the cut at my thigh and cinched it and then relaxed. Not like mercy, like a test. I had a new thought then that was ugly and plain. The field wasn't making a lantern. It wasn't making a rope. It was making a way to hold me here by the hinge points, so it could do the smaller work without me getting in the way. "Look at me," I said to my wife. "Don't look at them." She looked at me. I saw her face go white, and then red, and then steady. She is good. She chooses steady when she can. The old woman in the yellow dress stood 3 rows behind my wife, watching me. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't anything I could name. She was tall and thin, and her hat hung at a wrong angle. Her eyes, if that's what you call them, weren't blank. They were wrong in another way. They looked like fines, buttons from a box, Seeds from the storage shed you don't plant anymore, because the name on the sack is a brand no one uses. She wasn't there to save. She wasn't there to take. She was there the way a road is there when you finally see it through brush. It had always been there, and now it was useful. "Are you the first?" I asked her. "Or just the one who stood where I'm standing and thought the same wrong thoughts?" She lifted a hand, brushed her sleeve, and the dust that came off it was not dust. It was chaff, corn silk, bits of the same blue fiber. She didn't speak. Her mouth made the small movement old mouths make when they are counting quietly and lose count and start again. The lines did their work. My elbows were fixed. My wrists were set. A line slid across my chest like a strap and placed me. I could breathe. I couldn't put a shoulder into anything, and I couldn't sit. If you asked me then if I was scared, the answer would have been no, in the way a man who is under a fallen tree and can't feel his legs says no. The fear was busy somewhere else on other work. I was only the frame. Nets rose around me like scaffolding. They weren't to catch me. They were to keep shape. The knots at my side kept talking to one another, and I began to hear a pattern I could follow. 2 loops and a single, 3 doubles and a rest. An order that had nothing to do with me. An order that had lived here longer than I had been allowed to use the initials of this place for my checks. I went where men go then. I went to my father. I went to a day his hand gripped my shoulder and turned me at the fence when I was 12, and had broken the top wire and told me to do it right, and not make him come over there again. And the grip said love and anger together, like the same tool. He wasn't a tender man. He wasn't cruel either. He was exact. He would have looked at this and said, "You've got yourself in the works. Either you pull out now and leave everything bent and catch the next time you try to use it, or you let it run and see if it clears." I chose to let it run. A long piece of ribbon came up from the bulge with the dimple and the smell of the creek and passed under my left arm and over my right shoulder and crossed. It laid itself over the strap across my chest and pulled 5 small pulls, and I said my name in my head on each and did not say it out loud because my wife was saying it and the word had enough work without both of us pulling on it. The lines at my wrists eased for a breath. I could have pulled free right then if I'd wanted to tear skin and bone. It didn't do it because it was giving me a chance. It did it because it had measured the limits and knew it had margin. The kindness of good engineering. "I love you," I said into the dark where my wife was a shape and a voice. She said it back without thinking because that's how those words work when you've used them a long time like tools and not like ornaments. Something moved by my left knee. A small, soft thing. A rabbit, I thought, and then wanted to laugh with how my head liked circles. It wasn't a rabbit. It was the silk figure Donna had shown me, furry now with real silk laid over it, tied at the waist with a spotless length of blue ribbon. Not the dirty stuff from the field, but a new piece. It crawled with a steady progress that didn't look like life, and didn't look like a toy, and made its way up my boot and the ankle, and then it didn't have anywhere else to go, because the line across my thigh held it. It pressed its head against the line and stayed there, waiting, I suppose, for the next instruction. I closed my eyes and opened them, and the scarecrow had taken one more knot step toward me. It was near enough that I could have leaned my head forward, and the wet ribbon mouth would have been against my forehead. It didn't do that. It kept its distance measured and exact, and I recognized the measure. It had the same feel as the length between our fencer posts, the regular spacing you get when you set them with a tape. Something about that cut me deeper than any line. It wasn't wild. It wasn't random. It had the kind of rightness men bring to a job when they want to look at it later and not be ashamed. There was a sound that I had heard only once before, the day we lowered my father into the ground, and the straps that held the box creaked and settled, and the men at the corners went slack and backed away. A low, satisfied mar of material on material when a weight moves from hand to earth. The lines on me eased into holding. The nets around me lost interest. The knots kept their talking, but it was less urgent. The work had crossed a point. If a thing has a heart, the field had breathed out. "Listen," I said, though they were listening. "You can stop now." It wasn't a command. It wasn't a bargain. I said it because it is what we say to animals when they've done enough. My wife said my name again, and this time the field let the sound pass clean and hit me as if it had not been soaked through leaves. It felt like the last good thing I would get. Nothing came for my head. No line wrapped my throat. The work wasn't theater. It didn't want a show. It wanted a frame to hang the rest on later, when the plants dried and the nights came sooner, and the fog held longer, and the creek slowed to a brown thought under a scum. It didn't need to finish. It only needed to begin right. I knew then that the scarecrow's head had stayed ahead all these years, because the work of the head was nothing to the work of the hands. The field doesn't eat. It holds. "I'll stay," I said. "You took what you need. You leave the house." The old woman in the yellow dress bent at the waist and took hold of something near her feet. She lifted. A line of ribbon rose with the movement, slow as a bucket out of a well. She held it up and set it over a branch and tied it with one of the clean knots I couldn't tie if you gave me a week. Then she was gone again. Not vanished with drama, just stepped back into the place she had been pulled from, and that place filled up behind her and looked like it had never been touched. I stood in the circle a long time. The field dimmed and brightened and dimmed with the evening. My wife stayed where she was, because she is the kind of woman who can hold a place as if she nailed it. Donna came to the fence at some point and called my name once. Moose made one bark, and then a sound like a question, and then none at all. Our son's truck went by on the road and didn't slow, because he was on the way to the factory, and you don't miss your shift for your father's ghosts. When the sky went the color it goes before full dark, my wife's voice changed. Not because of fear, because she had to breathe differently to keep any sound in it. "What now?" she asked. "That's simple. You go in," I said. "You lock the door. You sit with the phone. You call our son in an hour and tell him I'm stubborn and fine. You tell him not to come. You make yourself tea. You keep the porch light off. If you hear anything, you talk to me like I'm in the next room." She stayed quiet a long breath. "And you?" "I'll be here," I said. "It wants me to be here. I won't try to be smart." She stood another minute and then did what I asked. I heard her steps. I heard nothing from the field to stop her. The rouse let her leave like water lets a hand go. It wasn't bad at first. The lines don't burn. They commit. They keep you from flinching. The worst part of pain is the small motion you make to dodge it and catch it from another angle. This didn't allow small motions. It was the kind of hold that a good doctor gives a baby for a shot, so the shot can be what it needs to be, and then be done. The moon came up and the knots slept. That felt wrong, but it was true. The lines went still. The field breathed in long, regular pulls. I slept standing, the way you sleep in a truck cab in a lot while the engine idles and you are not safe exactly, but you are not in motion. When I woke, the sun was back. Dew had gathered on the ribbon over my shoulder and ran down in 3 dark lines that made it look like a thing with a life. Birds tried for a while to sit on the nets and found no purchase, and went to the fence where they set their feet and hunched their necks and told each other it would rain. My wife came out with a cup of coffee. She stepped to the path's edge. She held the cup and didn't step off the gravel. I could smell the coffee. I could hear the heat still in it. I could hold none of that, and I didn't need to. I had plenty. She stayed a while and told me about nothing. A flyer, a call, a show she half-watched last night while she sat in the chair and kept my name going out of her every little while because she wouldn't let silence collect too thick. When she went in, I felt lighter and worse all at once. We lived like that 3 days. The field did a little work on me the first 2 and not on the 3rd. It wasn't all me. The lines stretched through sections of the circle I wasn't touching. They pulled knots to the far edge. They bit off tag ends and spit them into the ground like seed husks. I could feel the shape growing even if I couldn't see it. A loom moves and you can't read the cloth yet, but you feel the pattern's insistence. Men from the co-op came by on the 2nd day. They knocked on the door. My wife didn't let them in. She talked on the porch. They looked past her shoulder toward the field like men will. They asked if I was sick. She said yes in a way, and that we didn't need anything, and that the load next week would be ready same as always. They offered to send someone to check the pump, because they heard something odd at night. She said the pump was fine. They looked at each other with the small eye roll men do, because we don't like to be told not to be useful. They left. On the 4th day, I knew I could get free. The lines had loosened in a way I had not felt them loosen before. They had spent what they needed of me. I didn't move. The circle had a weight then that it hadn't had on the 1st day. It had the feel of a thing that has been started right and will finish itself, whether you like it or not. I could have walked out, and it would have finished without me, and then come to the house for someone else to set on the frame. I stayed. On the 5th day, Donna set a jar on the fence post and took 1 step toward the field, and then turned around and took 2 steps back and told Moose to stop looking. My wife brought another cup of coffee to the edge and set it on the ground, and the cup went cold, and the smell of it went sweet and old, and then was gone. And she picked it up later and washed it and put it back. The old woman in the yellow dress came and didn't come. Sometimes I saw her, sometimes I didn't. She never came close. She watched the way a person watches a pot to see if it will boil when they know it will, and they just want to be there when it does. On the 6th day, the scarecrow had new clothes. My gray shirt was gone. In its place was a shirt from my father's old wardrobe, sun-faded, patched at one elbow with cloth from a feed sack that had letters printed on it decades ago. I hadn't seen that shirt in years. Maybe it had been in a box in the shed and the field had known where. Maybe it was a trick of my head. It didn't matter. It hung right and looked right, and it made a firm line through my chest. A sorrow I could stand behind. On the 7th day, which sounds old-timey, but the number doesn't matter. The field let me go. It wasn't a tear or a snap. It was a motion like a hand undoing a belt and feeding it from the loops. The lines eased, and then a line would pull, and then ease, and then slack would gather, and some part of me would be mine again. The ribbon on my thigh slid off the cut. The numb came back in a rush. My wrists prickled. Blood moved. Pins and needles are a joke until everyone tells it at once. I bent my knees a little and came back into a body that had held still long enough that it wasn't sure what to do with the new options. I took a step. I was myself. I didn't fall. I didn't run. I stood and looked at the circle and saw what had been made. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't a picture. It was a map like I had thought before. A simple one. A grid I could hold in my head that matched the field's true lines in a way that didn't need lettering. There were 4 houses at the compass points, and a square in the middle, and the long road running north-south. The stone from the creek sat at the center like a courthouse. Around the circle, neat as a new lane in a town, ribbon ran from peg to peg and made a loop, and the ends were tied off in little knots that were too clean for my hands. A person who understands cloth would have understood more than I did. I understood enough. It was a way for the field to keep a record of the fact that it had chosen and had been answered. I walked out. The field let me. The rose didn't grab at my legs. The ribbons hung loose and had no interest in me now. I stepped onto the path. My wife didn't move right away. She looked at me like I had come back from a job I shouldn't have had to do, but had done anyway. She put her hand on my face. It was cool, and that was good. And I put my hand over hers, and we stood like that a while and didn't talk. We slept that night because a person can sleep after anything, even if they think they can't. The body has its own ideas. I woke to the sound of weaving anyway, steady and distant. It felt like rain that doesn't quite start. It wasn't for me anymore. It was there. I listened and then turned on my side and tucked my knees and watched the rectangle of the window grow less dark as the day came and thought, it is going to do this with or without me. We harvested. The numbers were all right. Not the best. Not the worst. The corn came in, dried, and went out on trucks whose drivers looked at their phones while the bin auger spit gold. I stood by and nodded to people who wanted nods, and I handed out paper cups of coffee and told 2 jokes because work likes jokes, and the jokes settle the dust. Donna brought pies. She said Moose was barking again, and she was grateful for it even when it made her head ring. She said she found no more silk figures on her porch and no more flies tied at the waist. She kept the jar with the flies in a cabinet under the sink. She would show them to no one again. That seemed right. We took down the scarecrow at season's end. We do it every year. You don't leave cloth on a stake for the winter unless you want to teach a thing questions you don't know how to answer. I took the hat and the shirt. I tried to take the head and couldn't. Not because it held firm, because when I set my hands on it, my hands decided against it. I don't think it would have broken. I think I would have broken. I left it. The winter was ordinary. Snow came. We drove to the city once to buy a heater part. I shoveled. I drank broth my wife made from a recipe her mother taught her. We watched the weather on television and listened to people argue about things and turned the sound down and watched their mouths move and let that be enough. I slept badly on some nights and better on others. When the wind cut over the field, I felt the shape of the circle in my back like an old bruise. In the spring, we planted again. You don't quit. You plant. You put seed in a line and hope the line pleases a thing bigger than you. I avoided the circle place when I could. That meant I thought about it more than if I'd just driven over it and let the planter do its path. I told myself to grow up. I drove over it. The planter hit the soft and the disc cut as if through butter, and then the disc hung and I had to back up and clear it. I set the seed. I moved on. Sometimes before dawn I wake and go to the porch and sit and look. The field is a place again, not a thing. It holds dew. It holds the smell that comes from dirt when it wants what it wants. It holds the sound of small animals doing their work. I don't watch for the woman in the yellow dress anymore. She came when she needed to, and that was that. I don't cut ribbons when I find them. I leave them. I don't tie any new ones either. I keep my hands for other ties. Our granddaughter grew a little and it showed. She runs to the edge of the field and mocks me with looks to see if I will chase her. I do. I catch her. I scoop her up and she laughs. I set her down and tell her we don't go in past the second row. And I know that when she's a little older, she'll go in past the second row, because that's what you do when someone you love tells you not to. I make my peace with some of that, while I can still make peace with it. Some of it I won't make peace with, and I know that too. The circle still shows, only a little. Grass wants to have it. We cut it and it tries again. If you know where to look, you can see the ground still smoother there, and less interested in letting water stand. Sometimes there are the smallest plugs at the compass points, little rises like the ones I pressed my finger into, now hard, now a darker shade after rain. I do not put my finger in them anymore. I have nothing more to say to that part of it. Once, middle of summer, when the corn had its height and the nights had their press, I walked to the edge with a flashlight and turned it off and let my eyes adjust. The field had the old weight. The rows made their thin, sharp sound like paper handled by quick hands. I heard the weaving easy and not aimed at me. It calmed me. Honest. That's not a thing you tell most people. It would sound wrong. But the rhythm told the truth about the ground, and true is what you take when there isn't anything else you trust. As for the scarecrow's head, sometimes I dream I lift it, and there is nothing underneath. Sometimes I dream I lift it, and there is a nest held there, a tight thing woven from ribbon and hair and silk, and in the nest is an egg the size of a fist, and the egg moves in a way eggs have no right to move. In those dreams I do different things. Sometimes I crush it. Sometimes I set it back and walk away. Mostly I wake before I choose and go stand at the sink and drink water and lean my head on the cupboard and count in the way you count when you're not counting anything. The co-op man asked me once, months later, if I had ever figured out what I'd been doing out there that week. He asked it like a joke and not a joke. He'd heard things. People hear things because we make them to fill the holes left by the truth we don't tuck in. I told him I had been in the field setting something right. He said, "We all are." And that was the best answer to any question I had heard in a long time. On a day near harvest, we got a letter in the mailbox with no return address. The front was written in slow, careful block letters. Inside was a single strip of blue ribbon like the others, folded once and again, and held with a pin that had rust on it that made my finger red when I touched it. No note, no call out. I showed it to my wife. She looked at it a while, and then put it back in the envelope and slid it into the junk drawer with the odd keys and the rubber bands and the tape measure with the crack in its lip and said, "We'll keep it." That was enough. I'm telling this because a man should set down the shape of a thing if he can do it without telling lies. That's harder than it sounds. I have left out handfuls. I have told you 1 minute and not another because the other minute has a face I don't like to see and doesn't belong to me alone. If you are the kind who asks for reasons, I don't have any you will like. The field is big and we are small. We kept a light on our place too long and called it ours, and the field let us because it likes men who work. It asked for a body to hold, and it asked clean. It didn't slither. It didn't whisper promises. It set a circle and tied knots and clicked, until a person who listened could hear a yes or a no. I said yes. I can't tell you how to say no to a thing that's older than the names on your deeds. When I walk the rows now, I sometimes put my hand out and let the leaves slap my palm. The edges leave thin cuts you don't notice right away. They sting later. I've stopped wiping the blood with spit. I let it dry and flake. The field doesn't want my blood. It never did. It wants order. It wants the long pull. It wants the lock and the release. It wants to be looked at long enough that you forget you're the one doing the looking, and then it looks at you and says, "Your turn." On the day we pulled the last wagon to the bin, and the dust lay golden enough to make even the ditch look rich, I stood at the circle and took off my hat and held it to my chest. I didn't pray. I don't know how to pray to a thing that doesn't promise. I counted, the way those knots had taught me. I counted to 5. I paused. I counted to 4. I counted to 3. I paused. I counted to 1. I felt the ground give the smallest give, like a quilt settling over a sleeping person's shoulder. At the fence, Moose barked once and then, considering the day settled, lay down. Donna waved a hand and went inside. My wife touched my back with her palm and left it there a while, and we stood and breathed, and the field breathed. And that was the bargain still holding. I don't go out there at night as much. I'm not scared. It's just not my shift anymore. If the weaving goes hard again, if the circle pulls up a new line, or we find small things on the porch tied with neat knots I can't undo, I'll step where I have to. You think you wouldn't, but you would. It's not bravado. It's arithmetic. You count heads inside your house, and then you count ones in the field, and you do whatever adds up. I don't think it will ask again soon. The work was careful. It feels like it will hold. I still check the pump when it hisses wrong. I still watch the pressure. I still carry a spare light. Habit is a kind of faith. When I walk back to the house, I look at the scarecrow. I adjust the hat when the wind has taken it. Sometimes I talk toward it the way you talk to a tool you like. Easy, not expecting an answer, aware of whose job it is to do the answering. There have been mornings when the early fog sits an inch above the ground and shows the lines in a way even the eye of a man who has promised himself not to see can't miss. Ribbons faint as veins, knots packed tight as berries, a made thing under the green thing under the blue thing. I drink my coffee, and I nod, and I go on. I guess that's all any of us do once we've been told what lies under our rows. We go on. We keep the names we have for things, and we make our hands busy, and we say yes, where we have to, and no where we can afford to, and we love the few we are allowed to keep. And when the knots start to click, we listen, We don't pretend not to hear. We decide whether we are the frame this time. And if we are, we stand still so the rest can pass through without tearing. That's not hero work. That's field work. Once, not long ago, I came home late from town. The truck's lights swung across the ditch in the edge of the field, and I saw someone standing there in the old road, not in a yellow dress this time, but in a shirt like the one my father wore the year we had a late frost, and he lost half a stand and did not swear, only walked out to the edge and put his hands in his pockets and stood. I slowed, rolled down the window, and said, without stopping, "You can go on." And the figure did not move or wave or vanish. It simply stood like a part of the field, and I passed and turned up the drive, and the moment had the feel of a knot tied clean and pressed flat with a thumbnail. I slept fine that night. I woke to the sound of the sprinkler arm, the drag and the click, the way it always was. The sun had not yet come, and the dark in the window was deep and simple. I lay and listened like a man will when his household's quiet, and I thought of rope and cloth and the long pull of a loom set true, and of my own hands, which have tied some poor knots and a few good ones, and will tie a few more before they won't. Then the birds started. The field breathed. The day opened and the work called, and I went to it. Which is how these stories end when you're lucky. Not with fire. Not with a shout. With the call to fix a thing with a crack in it, and a walk down a path you know by heart, and the feeling that when the time comes again, and it will, you will step into the circle because someone has to, and you love the ones at the house, and the field likes men who keep their word.